The summer of 1966 stretched endlessly before 6-year-old Tommy Henderson, each day promising new adventures in the rolling hills of West Virginia. On this particular Saturday morning in July, the boy pressed his nose against the kitchen window of their modest farmhouse, watching his father load a wicker picnic basket into the back of their powder-blue Chevrolet Impala. "Tommy, get away from that window before you smudge it up," his mother Martha called from the stove where she was wrapping the last of the fried chicken in wax paper. Her voice carried the gentle authority that only mothers possess, mixed with the excitement of a family outing. "Go get your swimming trunks and that new camera your daddy bought you." The boy's eyes lit up at the mention of his prized possession, a small Kodak Instamatic that his father Robert had given him for his 6th birthday just 2 weeks prior. Tommy had been fascinated by the idea of capturing moments forever, though most of his photographs so far had been blurry shots of their German Shepherd, Rex, or extreme close-ups of flowers in his mother's garden. "Where are we going again, Mama?" Tommy asked, though he'd heard the destination mentioned several times that morning. "Lake Shawnee," Martha replied, smoothing down his unruly brown hair with a damp cloth. "Your daddy says there's an old amusement park there that's been closed for years, but the lake is perfect for swimming and the grounds are nice for picnicking." Robert Henderson emerged from the garage, wiping motor oil from his hands with a red rag. At 32, he was a sturdy man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work at the local coal mine. The promise of a day away from the dark tunnels underground had put an extra spring in his step. "You ready for an adventure, sport?" he asked Tommy, ruffling the boy's already disheveled hair. "I hear there are still some old rides there, though they're not working anymore. Might be interesting to explore as long as we're careful." Martha shot her husband a warning look. "Robert, you make sure he stays close. I don't like the idea of him wandering around some abandoned place." "Don't worry, honey, we'll stick together. Besides, it's just an old amusement park. What could happen?" The drive to Lake Shawnee took them through winding mountain roads, lined with dense forests of oak and maple trees. Tommy sat in the back seat, his camera clutched tightly in his small hands, watching the landscape roll by through the rear window. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, creating dancing shadows on the asphalt that seemed to wave at the passing car. As they crested a hill, the lake came into view, a serene body of water surrounded by overgrown grass and the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving amusement park. Rusted swing sets stood like silent sentinels near the water's edge, while the twisted metal of old rides created eerie silhouettes against the clear blue sky. "Look at that," Robert whispered, pulling the car into a clearing near the lake. "Hard to believe families used to come here for fun." Tommy pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared at the abandoned playground equipment. There was something both fascinating and unsettling about the scene, as if time had stopped in the middle of a summer day decades ago, leaving behind only memories and rust. "Can I take pictures, Daddy?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with the innocent excitement that only a child could muster in the face of such desolation. "Of course, son. Just remember what I taught you about holding the camera steady." As the family unpacked their picnic supplies, a gentle breeze stirred the tall grass around the lake, creating a soft, whispering sound that seemed to welcome them to Lake Shawnee. None of them noticed how the wind carried with it the faint echo of children's laughter, laughter that had been silent for far too long. The Henderson family spread their red, checkered blanket on a patch of grass overlooking the lake, close enough to enjoy the gentle lapping of water against the shore, but far enough from the rusted amusement park equipment to ease Martha's concerns. The July sun beat down warmly, and dragonflies danced over the water's surface in lazy circles. Tommy couldn't sit still. His eyes kept wandering to the old swing set about 50 yards away, where 2 rusty chains hung from a weathered metal frame. One swing was missing entirely, leaving only frayed cables swaying in the breeze, while the other held a wooden seat that had been worn smooth by countless children over the years. "Daddy, can I go look at the swings?" Tommy asked, his small hands already gripping his camera. Robert glanced toward the playground equipment, then at his wife. Martha was busy unpacking sandwiches, and seemed less anxious now that they were settled in the peaceful setting. "I suppose it's all right, but stay where we can see you, and don't touch anything that looks sharp or broken." Tommy nodded eagerly and bounded toward the swing set, his sneakers crushing the overgrown grass beneath his feet. As he approached the rusted frame, he noticed how quiet everything had become. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, and the gentle breeze that had been stirring the trees just moments before had died to an eerie stillness. The boy raised his camera and peered through the viewfinder, trying to frame the swing set against the backdrop of the lake. Through the small rectangular window, He could see his parents in the distance, Martha spreading mustard on sandwiches, while Robert stretched out on the blanket with his hands behind his head. Click. The camera's shutter snapped, capturing the desolate playground equipment in sharp black and white detail. Tommy lowered the camera and walked closer to the remaining swing. The wooden seat hung at the perfect height for a child his size, as if it had been waiting for him. He glanced back toward his parents. They were still busy with lunch preparations and hadn't seemed to notice how far he'd wandered. Climbing onto the swing, Tommy felt the old wood creak under his weight. He began to pump his legs, slowly at first, then with growing confidence as the swing carried him higher. The sensation of flying through the air filled him with joy, and for a moment he forgot about the eerie atmosphere of the abandoned park. As he swung back and forth, Tommy noticed something strange. In the tall grass near the base of the swing set, there appeared to be small indentations in the earth, circular patterns that looked almost like footprints, but smaller than any adult would make. Children's footprints, he realized, though that seemed impossible. No other families were at the lake today. The swing began to slow, and as it did, Tommy heard something that made his blood run cold. Soft giggling, like that of other children, seemed to be coming from somewhere behind him. He turned his head, expecting to see other kids who had arrived at the lake while he was swinging, but the area remained empty. "Hello?" Tommy called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. Even the insects had gone quiet. Tommy felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm summer air, and he suddenly wanted nothing more than to return to his parents' side. As he prepared to jump off the swing, Tommy heard his father's voice calling from the picnic area. "Tommy, come back here, son. Lunch is ready." The boy looked toward his parents and waved, then turned back to face the lake one more time. That's when he saw her, a little girl in a faded dress standing at the water's edge, her dark hair hanging in wet strands around her pale face. She appeared to be about his age, maybe younger, and she was staring directly at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her small face. Tommy blinked hard and looked again, but the girl was gone. Only the gentle lapping of water against the shore remained, as if she had never been there at all. Shaking his head, Tommy jumped off the swing and began walking back toward his family. As he did, he raised his camera one more time and snapped a picture of himself sitting on the swing, with the lake and the mysterious water's edge visible in the background. He had no way of knowing that this photograph would become the most important piece of evidence in one of West Virginia's most enduring mysteries. "You sure took your time getting back here," Martha said, as Tommy rejoined his parents at the picnic blanket. She studied her son's face with the keen perception that mothers develop, noting the slight pallor in his cheeks. "You feeling all right, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tommy glanced back toward the swing set, then at his parents. How could he explain the giggling he'd heard, or the strange girl by the water who had vanished like morning mist? Adults never believed children about such things. "I'm okay, Mama. Just got a little dizzy on the swing." Robert handed his son a glass of lemonade from the thermos Martha had packed. "Well, sit down and have some lunch. Your mother made your favorite, peanut butter and grape jelly." As Tommy bit into his sandwich, he found himself studying the lake more carefully. The water stretched out before them, deceptively peaceful under the afternoon sun, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from beneath the surface. "Daddy," Tommy said between bites, "why did they close the amusement park? It looks like it could still work." Robert's expression grew thoughtful as he gazed at the rusted rides scattered around the property. "Well, son, this place has quite a history. Lake Shawnee opened back in the 1920s, and for a while it was the most popular attraction in the county. Families would come from all over West Virginia to ride the Ferris wheel and swim in the lake. But then bad things started happening," Martha added quietly, her eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "Accidents mostly. Children getting hurt on the rides." "What kind of accidents?" Tommy asked, his curiosity overriding the unease he'd felt at the swing set. Robert shifted uncomfortably. "There was a little girl who drowned in the lake back in 1966, same year as this, actually, and a boy who was killed when one of the swings hit him. Chain snapped, they said. After that, people started talking about the place being cursed." Tommy nearly choked on his lemonade. "A boy died on the swings?" "Now, Robert," Martha warned, "you're going to give him nightmares." "He asked, honey. Besides, it's just old stories. The truth is probably much simpler. Equipment got old, safety standards weren't what they are today. People just like to make up ghost stories about places like this." But Tommy wasn't convinced. He remembered the giggling he'd heard, the perfect circle of children's footprints in the grass, and especially the pale girl by the water's edge. "Daddy, did anyone ever say they saw things here? Like people who weren't really there?" Robert and Martha exchanged a meaningful look. "Why do you ask, Sport?" "Just wondering," Tommy said, but his voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for a 6-year-old. Martha reached over and smoothed his hair. "Tommy, sometimes when we're in unfamiliar places, our imagination can play tricks on us. Old buildings and empty spaces can feel spooky, but that doesn't mean anything supernatural is happening." As if summoned by her words, a sudden gust of wind swept across the lake, strong enough to scatter their napkins and send ripples racing across the water's surface. The rusted swings began to creak and sway, their chains making a rhythmic sound that seemed almost musical, like a lullaby played in a minor key. Tommy watched the swings move back and forth with no one pushing them, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach. The wind had come from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly, leaving the air still and heavy once again. "That was strange," Robert murmured, looking up at the cloudless sky. "Weather's been clear all day." But Tommy wasn't listening to his father anymore. His attention was fixed on the swing set, where he could swear he saw a small figure sitting on the remaining swing, pumping its legs to go higher and higher. The figure was translucent, like looking through water, but unmistakably the shape of a child. "Mama," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" Martha followed his gaze toward the swings, now motionless again in the still air. "See what, honey?" Tommy blinked hard and the figure was gone. Only empty swings remained, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the tree line. But the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by invisible playmates, refused to leave him. The afternoon wore on with deceptive tranquility. Robert dozed on the blanket while Martha read a paperback romance novel, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Tommy had grown restless again, his small body unable to remain still as his mind processed the strange things he'd witnessed. "Can I go exploring a little more, Mama?" he asked, camera still clutched in his hands. "I promise, I won't go far." Martha looked up from her book, noting the pleading expression on her son's face. The peaceful setting had lulled her initial concerns, and she could see him clearly from where they sat. "All right, but stay in sight. And Tommy, don't go near the water by yourself." Tommy nodded eagerly and set off toward a different section of the abandoned amusement park. Beyond the swing set, he could make out the rusted skeleton of what had once been a small Ferris wheel, its passenger cars long since removed or rotted away. Broken concrete pathways snaked between overgrown flower beds where weeds now bloomed in wild profusion. As he walked, Tommy became increasingly aware that he wasn't alone. Footsteps seemed to echo his own, small light steps that matched his pace perfectly. When he stopped to examine a rusted piece of playground equipment, the other footsteps stopped too. When he resumed walking, they began again. "Hello?" Tommy called out, turning in a complete circle. "Is someone there?" The footsteps ceased, but now Tommy could hear something else. Children's voices, faint and distant, as if carried on a breeze that touched only his ears. They seemed to be coming from all directions at once, a chorus of young voices engaged in some eternal game of hide-and-seek. 1, 2, 3, ready or not, here I come. You can't catch me. It's my turn to swing. The voices grew clearer as Tommy moved deeper into the abandoned park grounds. He raised his camera and began taking pictures, hoping to capture something, anything, that would prove he wasn't imagining things. Through the viewfinder, he could swear he saw movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that darted between the rusted rides when he wasn't looking directly at them. Click. A photo of the broken Ferris wheel. Click. A shot of an overturned picnic table covered in moss. Click. An image of the lake from a different angle where ripples disturbed the surface despite the absence of any wind. As Tommy lowered his camera after the third shot, he found himself face to face with a group of children. They stood in a semicircle around him, their clothes from different eras. Some wore the simple dresses and knickers of the 1920s, others the play clothes of the 1950s. All of them were pale and translucent, like figures made of morning fog. "You can see us," said a girl in a blue dress with white collar, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and sadness. She appeared to be about 8 years old, with dark ringlets framing her ethereal face. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs, but strangely, he felt no fear. These children seemed as curious about him as he was about them. Are you ghosts?" A boy in suspenders and knickers stepped forward. "We're not ghosts," he said seriously. "We're just stuck. We've been playing here for so long we can't remember how to leave." "How long?" Tommy whispered. The children looked at each other with expressions of confusion and loss. "Time works differently here," the girl in blue explained. "We remember our last day, but then everything gets fuzzy. We keep playing the same games, swinging on the same swings, swimming in the same lake. But we can't finish the games," added another child, a small boy with a sailor suit who couldn't have been more than 5. "Something always interrupts us. Something pulls us down." Tommy felt a chill run through him despite the warm afternoon air. "Pulls you down where?" The children began to fade at the edges, their forms becoming less distinct. The girl in blue reached out a hand toward Tommy, but when he tried to touch her fingers, his hand passed through empty air. "Don't let it take you," she whispered urgently, her voice growing distant. "Don't let it pull you under. The lake is hungry, and it's been waiting for someone new to play with." "Wait," Tommy called out, but the children were disappearing like smoke in the wind. "Don't go, tell me what you mean." But they were gone, leaving only the rustle of grass in a breeze that Tommy couldn't feel. He stood alone among the rusted rides, his camera heavy in his small hands, wondering if anyone would believe what he'd just experienced. From the picnic area, he could hear his father's voice calling his name. It was time to go home. But as Tommy turned to rejoin his parents, he couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the placid surface of Lake Shawnee was indeed hungry, and that it had been watching him all afternoon with ancient, patient eyes. Tommy hurried back toward his parents, his mind reeling from the encounter with the ghostly children. Their warning echoed in his ears. "Don't let it pull you under. The lake is hungry." He clutched his camera tighter, as if the solid weight of it could anchor him to the world of the living. "There you are," Martha called as he approached the picnic blanket. "We were starting to worry. Did you get some good pictures?" Tommy nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. He settled onto the blanket beside his mother, grateful for her warm presence and the familiar scent of her lavender perfume. It helped push away the lingering chill he'd felt among the rusted rides. Robert stretched and checked his wristwatch. "What do you say we pack up soon and head home? Your mother wants to stop at the grocery store before it closes." "Can we go swimming first?" Tommy asked suddenly, the words surprising even himself. He hadn't planned to ask, but something deep inside him, something that didn't feel entirely like his own desire, was pulling him toward the water. Martha frowned. "I don't know, honey. We didn't bring proper swimming clothes, and I'm not sure about the water quality in an old place like this." "Please?" Tommy found himself pleading, though part of his mind was screaming warnings. "Just for a few minutes? It's so hot, and the water looks nice and cool." Robert looked toward the lake where the afternoon sun cast dancing diamonds across the surface. "I suppose we could wade a little, just to cool our feet." Despite her reservations, Martha began packing away the remains of their lunch. "Well, if we're going to do it, let's be quick about it. And Tommy, you stay right beside us. No swimming out deep." The family made their way down to the water's edge, where tall reeds swayed gently in the shallows. Tommy kicked off his sneakers and rolled up his pants legs, then stepped into the lake. The water was surprisingly warm, almost bath-like, and felt silky against his skin. "This is nice," Robert said, wading in up to his ankles. "The water's warmer than I expected." Tommy ventured a little deeper, the lake bottom soft and muddy between his toes. Something about the water felt different from other lakes he'd swum in, thicker somehow, as if it carried more than just H2O within its depths, ancient memories perhaps, or the weight of too many secrets. "Tommy, don't go so far," Martha called from the shore, where she'd chosen to remain dry. "Come back closer to us." But Tommy found it difficult to obey. With each step deeper into the lake, he felt a strange pull, as if invisible hands were gently guiding him toward the center of the water. The sensation wasn't frightening exactly, but it was insistent, a whispered invitation to join something wonderful waiting just beneath the surface. "There are fish down here," Tommy called back to his parents, though he couldn't actually see any fish. The words seemed to come from somewhere else, spoken through his mouth by a voice that wasn't quite his own. "Really pretty ones. They want to show me something." Robert looked up sharply. "Tommy, come back here right now. The water's getting deeper." Tommy looked down and was startled to realize the water now reached his chest. When had he waded out so far? He tried to take a step back toward shore, but his feet felt heavy, as if the muddy bottom was reluctant to let him go. "I can't," Tommy said, panic creeping into his voice. "My feet are stuck." Robert plunged deeper into the water, his work boots splashing as he hurried toward his son. "It's just mud, Tommy. Lift your feet up high and take big steps." But as Robert reached for Tommy, something extraordinary and terrifying happened. The water around Tommy began to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light, as if lit from within by some underwater aurora. Shapes moved beneath the surface. Not fish, but the translucent forms of the children Tommy had seen earlier. They were swimming in circles around him, their ghostly hands reaching up from the depths. The girl in the blue dress was among them, her mouth open in a silent scream of warning. She pointed frantically toward the deeper water, where something much larger and darker was rising from the lake bottom. "Daddy, do you see them?" Tommy whispered. But when he looked toward his father, Robert's expression showed only confusion and growing fear. "See what?" "Tommy, grab my hand." Robert lunged forward and seized Tommy's wrist, just as the boy felt something cold and massive brush against his legs beneath the water. Whatever it was enormous, bigger than a person, bigger than a car, and it radiated a hunger that seemed to have been building for decades. The ghostly children scattered like startled fish as Robert pulled Tommy backward through the water, both of them stumbling toward shore. The phosphorescent glow faded, leaving only ordinary lake water lapping at their legs. "What happened out there?" Martha demanded as they reached dry land, her face pale with worry. "You both look like you've seen the devil himself." Tommy looked back at the lake, now peaceful and innocent under the late afternoon sun. The dark presence he'd felt was gone, but he knew it was still there, waiting beneath the surface for the next opportunity. "Nothing, Mama," he said quietly, though his whole body was trembling. "Just got scared of the deep water, I guess." The Henderson family quickly gathered their belongings, the peaceful mood of their picnic shattered by the disturbing incident at the water's edge. Tommy remained unusually quiet as he helped fold the checkered blanket, his small hands still trembling slightly from his encounter with whatever lurked beneath Lake Shawnee's deceptively calm surface. "Let's get you into some dry clothes," Martha said, wrapping a towel around Tommy's shoulders. She kept glancing nervously at the lake, as if expecting something to emerge from its depths at any moment. Robert loaded the picnic basket into the trunk of their Chevrolet, his movements hurried and purposeful. The incident in the water had shaken him more than he cared to admit. For a brief moment, when he'd reached for Tommy, he could have sworn he felt something else grab at the boy's legs, something with fingers far too long and cold to be human. "Daddy," Tommy said as they prepared to leave, "can I take one more picture of the swing set?" Robert hesitated, clearly wanting to leave this place behind them, but something in his son's voice, a desperate need to capture what they'd experienced, made him nod reluctantly. "Make it quick, sport. One picture, then we're heading home." Tommy walked back toward the rusty swing set with his camera, but this time he wasn't alone. Though his parents couldn't see them, the ghostly children had returned, clustering around him like protective spirits. The girl in the blue dress walked beside him, her translucent form flickering in and out of visibility. "You have to be careful," she whispered, her voice like wind through autumn leaves. "It's getting stronger. The thing in the lake, it feeds on children's energy, their life force. That's why we can't leave. It won't let us." Tommy raised his camera and looked through the viewfinder at the swing set. Through the lens he could see all of the ghostly children clearly, their forms more solid and defined than when he looked at them with his naked eyes. They stood in a group behind the swings, their faces filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Why can you see us when your parents can't?" asked the boy in the sailor suit. "I don't know," Tommy admitted. "Maybe because I'm still little. Adults don't seem to see things the way kids do." The girl in blue stepped closer, her expression urgent. "Listen to me carefully. If something happens, if the thing in the lake tries to take you, don't fight it at first. Pretend to go along, but remember that you're still alive. You have something we lost long ago." "What's that?" "Choice. We've been here so long, we forgot we could choose to leave. But you can still choose to fight back, to go home to your family. Just remember, you don't belong here yet." Tommy lowered his camera, confused by her words. "What do you mean, if something happens? Are you saying—" But before the girl could answer, Tommy heard his father calling impatiently from the car. "Tommy, come on, son, we need to get going." Tommy looked back toward his parents, then raised his camera one final time. He wanted to capture this moment, not just the rusted swing set, but somehow the presence of the ghostly children, the weight of their warning, the strange pull he'd felt toward the dark waters of the lake. He climbed onto the swing and sat down, holding the camera out at arm's length to take a picture of himself. Through the viewfinder, he could see the lake in the background and the faint outlines of the ghostly children gathered around him. The girl in blue stood directly behind the swing, her hands resting protectively on the chains. Click. The camera's shutter snapped, capturing what would become the most famous and mysterious photograph in West Virginia's history. In the image, Tommy Henderson sat on the swing, his 6-year-old face turned toward the camera with an expression that seemed far too knowing for his age. Behind him, barely visible but unmistakably present to those who knew how to look, were the faint outlines of children who had been playing at Lake Shawnee for far longer than any living child should. But as Tommy lowered the camera and prepared to return to his parents, he felt the familiar pull again, stronger this time, as if the act of taking the photograph had somehow bound him more deeply to this place and its restless spirits. The swing began to move on its own, carrying him back and forth with increasing momentum. Tommy tried to jump off, but his hands wouldn't release the chains. The ghostly children around him began to fade, their voices growing distant. "Remember what I told you," the girl in blue called out as her form became increasingly transparent. "You still have a choice. Don't forget who you are." And then, as the swing carried Tommy higher and higher into the fading afternoon light, everything changed. Robert Henderson honked the car horn twice, the sound echoing across Lake Shawnee's eerily still grounds. "Tommy, we're leaving now." Martha turned in the passenger seat, craning her neck to see their son at the swing set. Through the rear window of their Chevrolet, she could make out Tommy's small figure on the swing. But something about the scene troubled her. The swing seemed to be moving with an unnatural rhythm, too steady and mechanical for a child's play. "Robert, something's not right," she said, her voice tight with maternal instinct. "Look how high that swing is going. Tommy's not strong enough to pump that hard." Robert squinted toward the playground equipment, his hand already reaching for the door handle. The swing was indeed moving with impossible momentum, carrying Tommy so high that at the peak of each arc, he seemed to hang suspended in the air for a heartbeat too long. "Stay in the car," Robert told his wife, stepping out onto the grass. "Tommy!" he called, his voice carrying an edge of authority. "Get off that swing right now!" But Tommy couldn't respond. As the swing carried him through its hypnotic arc, he felt himself slipping away from the physical world. Each time the swing reached its highest point, he could see further and further across the lake, not just the surface, but somehow through it, into the dark depths where something ancient and hungry waited with infinite patience. The ghostly children had gathered around the swing set again, but now they seemed frantic, their translucent forms flickering like candle flames in a storm. The girl in blue was shouting something, but her voice sounded far away, as if she were calling from across a great distance. "Hold on to yourself," she cried. "Remember your name. Remember your family." Tommy tried to speak, tried to call out to his father, who was running toward him across the overgrown grass, but his voice seemed trapped in his throat. The swing was no longer just moving through space. It was moving through time itself, carrying him backward through the decades of Lake Shawnee's dark history. With each swing forward, he glimpsed the amusement park as it had been in the 1950s, alive with families and laughter, the Ferris wheel turning lazily against a summer sky. With each swing backward, he saw the same scene growing darker, the families replaced by shadows, the laughter fading into screams. "Tommy!" Robert's voice seemed to come from very far away now, though he was only yards from the swing set. "Tommy, jump off! Jump off right now!" But when Tommy looked down, he realized with growing horror that his feet were no longer touching anything solid. The swing had carried him so high that he was now suspended impossibly in the air, held aloft by forces that had nothing to do with chains and momentum. Below him, he could see his father running, his face contorted with panic. Behind Robert, Martha had gotten out of the car and was following, her hands pressed to her mouth in terror. They looked so small from this height, so helpless. The dark thing in the lake began to rise. Tommy felt it before he saw it, a presence so massive and ancient that it seemed to displace the very air around the lake. The water began to churn and bubble, as if something enormous was stirring in the depths. The ghostly children scattered like startled birds, all except the girl in blue, who remained beside the swing set with her arms outstretched toward Tommy. "Fight it!" she screamed. "You're still alive. You can still choose." But as the swing reached the peak of what would be its final arc, Tommy felt himself being pulled not down toward the earth, but sideways, into a space between worlds where the children of Lake Shawnee played their eternal games. The last thing he saw was his father reaching the empty swing set, his hands grasping at chains that held nothing but air. The swing came to a gentle stop, creaking softly in the breeze. On the ground beside it lay Tommy's small sneakers, placed neatly side by side, as if he had simply stepped out of them to walk barefoot through the grass. Robert stared at the empty swing in disbelief, then spun around, scanning the entire area. "Tommy, Tommy!" His voice cracked as it echoed across the lake. Martha reached the swing set moments later, her eyes taking in the scene with the terrible clarity that comes with a mother's worst nightmare realized. The empty swing, the abandoned shoes, the complete absence of her child. "Where is he?" she whispered, then louder, more desperately. "Where is he?" But Lake Shawnee kept its secrets, as it had for so many years before. The water lapped peacefully at the shore. The rusted ride stood silent in the growing twilight, and somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, 6-year-old Tommy Henderson had simply ceased to exist in the world his parents knew. The only evidence that he had been there at all was his camera, lying in the grass where it had fallen, and inside it, a roll of film that would soon reveal the most haunting photograph ever taken at Lake Shawnee. August 15th, 2001. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her wide-brimmed hat against the West Virginia sun as she surveyed the overgrown grounds of Lake Shawnee Amusement Park. At 42, she was one of the country's leading paranormal archaeologists, a field that combined her love of history with her fascination for unexplained phenomena. The abandoned park had been on her research list for years, but it was only now, with funding from the History Channel for their new documentary series, America's Haunted Places, that she'd been able to organize a proper investigation. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts," called out Marcus Webb, her research partner, as he carried a collection of electronic equipment toward the old swing set. "I've never seen baseline EMF levels this high in a supposedly inactive location." Dr. Mitchell nodded, making notes on her clipboard. She'd read the files, of course, every documented incident at Lake Shawnee since its opening in 1926. The accidental deaths, the mysterious disappearances, the reports of ghostly sightings that had persisted even after the park's closure. But one case in particular had drawn her attention: the vanishing of 6-year-old Tommy Henderson in July 1966. "Tell me about the Henderson boy again," she said to Detective Ray Kowalski, the retired police officer who had worked the original case and agreed to consult on the documentary. Kowalski, now 73 with steel-gray hair and deeply lined hands, pulled out a worn manila folder. Tommy Henderson, age 6, disappeared in broad daylight while his parents were packing up from a family picnic. One minute he was on that swing over there, the next minute he was gone. Only thing left behind were his shoes, placed neat as you please beside the swing set. No body was ever found. We searched for weeks, brought in tracking dogs, volunteer search parties, even had the lake dragged twice. Nothing. It was like the earth just swallowed him up. Kowalski's voice carried the weight of 35 years of unanswered questions. His parents never got over it. Robert Henderson died of a heart attack 10 years later, and Martha, well, she spent the rest of her life visiting psychics and mediums, trying to find out what happened to her boy. Dr. Mitchell examined a series of black and white photographs from the case file. The crime scene photos showed the empty swing set, the abandoned shoes, and the spot where the Henderson family had held their picnic. But it was the final photograph that captured her attention, the one found in Tommy's camera after the disappearance. The image showed the boy sitting on the swing, looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed far too mature for his 6 years. Behind him, the lake stretched out peacefully, but there was something else in the photograph, faint, almost subliminal shapes that could have been tricks of light and shadow or could have been something much more significant. "This photograph has been analyzed by experts for decades," Dr. Mitchell said, holding it up to the light. "Some claim they can see ghostly figures around the swing set. Others insist it's just pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist." "I can tell you what I see," Kowalski said quietly. "I see a scared little boy who somehow knew he was in danger. Look at his eyes. That's not the expression of a kid having fun at a playground." Marcus approached with a digital camera, equipped with full-spectrum imaging capabilities. "Dr. Mitchell, I'd like to take some comparison shots from the exact same angle as the Henderson photograph. If there really are environmental factors at play here, electromagnetic anomalies, temperature variations, anything that might affect photographic equipment, we should be able to detect them." As the team set up their equipment around the swing set, Dr. Mitchell found herself drawn to the spot where Tommy Henderson had last been seen. The original swing had long since been removed by vandals or weather, but the metal frame remained, weathered and rust-stained, but still structurally sound. She placed her hand on one of the support posts, and immediately felt a strange sensation, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, as if something massive was stirring far below the surface. The feeling was so intense that she jerked her hand back, startled. "Did you feel that?" she asked Marcus, who was adjusting his camera settings nearby. "Feel what?" Dr. Mitchell pressed her palm against the metal frame again. This time the vibration was stronger, accompanied by a sound so low it was more felt than heard. A deep, resonant humming that seemed to emanate from the lake itself. "There's definitely something unusual about this location," she said, making more notes. "I think we need to expand our investigation beyond just electromagnetic readings and photography. I want ground-penetrating radar, soil samples, and a complete hydrological survey of the lake." As if summoned by her words, a gentle breeze stirred the tall grass around the swing set, but Dr. Mitchell noticed something odd about the wind pattern. It seemed to move in a perfect circle around the metal frame, as if following some invisible barrier. And in that circling wind, she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of children's laughter, drifting across 35 years of silence. The ground-penetrating radar painted a picture that defied explanation. Dr. Mitchell stared at the monitor, as the waves revealed what lay beneath the soil around Lake Shawnee's swing set, her scientific training warring with the impossible evidence before her eyes. "These readings can't be accurate," Marcus muttered, adjusting the equipment settings for the third time. "According to this, there are massive hollow spaces under the ground, like a network of caves or tunnels, but the geological surveys of this area show solid bedrock starting at about 8 feet down." Dr. Mitchell knelt beside the area where Tommy Henderson's shoes had been found 35 years earlier. The grass here grew differently than in the surrounding area, slightly greener, more lush, as if the soil contained unusual nutrients. "What about the soil samples? Any preliminary results?" Their graduate assistant, Jenny Chen, looked up from her portable testing kit with a puzzled expression. "The mineral content is completely anomalous. High levels of calcium phosphate, which you'd expect to find in areas with significant bone deposits, but also traces of elements that shouldn't exist in West Virginia soil, rare earth metals, isotopes that typically form under extreme pressure conditions." Detective Kowalski had been unusually quiet during the morning's investigations, but now he spoke up with the weight of decades behind his words. "You know, in all the years since Tommy disappeared, this spot has never been quite right. Grass grows too thick here, flowers bloom out of season, and every summer, without fail, people report seeing a little boy playing on a swing that isn't there anymore. Eyewitness accounts can be unreliable," Dr. Mitchell said, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. "Pareidolia, suggestion, the power of local legend, maybe, but I've seen the reports myself, dozens of them over the years, all describing the same thing, a small boy with brown hair and a camera, swinging higher than physics should allow." As if responding to Kowalski's words, the EMF detector in Marcus's hands began shrieking with readings that pushed the device beyond its calibrated limits. The temperature around the swing set dropped 15 degrees in less than 30 seconds, causing their breath to mist in the sudden cold. "Equipment malfunction," Marcus said quickly, but his hands were shaking as he tried to reset the detectors. Dr. Mitchell felt the vibration in the metal frame again, stronger this time, so intense it made her teeth ache. But now she could hear something else mixed with that deep, earth-shaking hum. A child's voice, faint but distinct, calling out words that chilled her to the bone. "Help me. I want to go home." Jenny dropped her soil samples, the containers scattering across the grass. Did anyone else hear that? All 4 members of the investigation team stood frozen, listening to the impossible sound of a voice that had been silent for 35 years. The words came again, clearer this time, carried on a breeze that touched only the area around the swing set. "I can see my house from here. Why won't Mama and Daddy come get me?" Dr. Mitchell's scientific skepticism crumbled as she recognized the voice from the audio recordings in the case files, interviews with the Henderson family from 1966, including a brief recording of Tommy talking about his new camera. The voice calling from beneath the ground was unmistakably the same. "We need to excavate," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Right here, right now. Sarah, think about what you're saying," Marcus warned. "This is an active crime scene. We can't just start digging without proper authorization." But Detective Kowalski was already pulling a shovel from their equipment truck. The case was officially closed in 1971 when Tommy Henderson was declared legally dead. As far as the law is concerned, this is just archaeological research now. The first shovelful of earth came up easily, too easily, as if the ground wanted to give up its secrets. The soil was dark and rich, almost black, and it carried a smell that reminded Dr. Mitchell of old museums, dust and time and things long preserved. 3 feet down they found the first bone. It was small, delicate, unmistakably from a child's hand, but as they carefully excavated around it, they realized it wasn't just one bone, but an entire skeleton perfectly preserved and positioned as if the child had been buried while sitting upright. "This doesn't make sense," Jenny whispered, photographing the remains in situ. "The preservation is impossible. Organic material shouldn't last this long in these soil conditions. And look at the position. It's like he's still sitting on an invisible swing." Dr. Mitchell's hands trembled as she brushed dirt away from the small skull. Clutched in the skeleton's bony fingers was a corroded but recognizable object, a vintage Kodak Instamatic camera, the same model that Tommy Henderson had been carrying when he disappeared. But what stopped her heart was what she saw when she looked up from the grave. Standing around the excavation site, visible as clearly as the living members of her team, were the ghostly figures of children from different eras. A girl in a 1920s dress, a boy in 1950s play clothes, others in clothing spanning decades of fashion. And in the center of the group, looking exactly as he had in that last photograph, stood Tommy Henderson. His 6-year-old face was filled with a mixture of hope and confusion as he looked down at his own remains. "You found me," he said, his voice carrying across 35 years of waiting. "Does this mean I can go home now?" Dr. Mitchell stared at the ghostly figure of Tommy Henderson, her scientific worldview crumbling like sand. The boy looked exactly as he had in the photograph from 1966. 6 years old, brown hair tousled by invisible wind, holding his camera with the serious expression children wear when they think they're being very important. "You can see him too, can't you?" Detective Kowalski asked quietly, his weathered face pale with wonder and fear. "This is impossible," Marcus whispered, but his camera was clicking frantically, capturing digital images of empty air where the rest of the team could clearly see the ghostly children. "The electromagnetic readings are going crazy, but the thermal imaging shows nothing." Tommy stepped closer to the excavation site, looking down at his own skeletal remains with the detached curiosity that only children possess. "Is that really me? I don't remember lying down there." The girl in the blue dress from the 1920s moved to stand beside him. Dr. Mitchell recognized her from historical photographs she'd seen in her research, Lucy Keyes, who had drowned in Lake Shawnee in 1926, one of the park's first recorded casualties. "Time works differently here," Lucy explained to Tommy, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "We play the same games over and over, but we never remember how they end. Only that something always calls us back to the beginning." "What calls you back?" Dr. Mitchell found herself asking, addressing the spirits directly despite every rational instinct screaming against it. Lucy pointed toward the lake, where the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the water. "It's been here much longer than the amusement park, much longer than any of us. The Shawnee knew about it. That's why this was sacred ground, why they buried their dead here. They thought the rituals would keep it sleeping." As if summoned by her words, the water began to churn and bubble. Dr. Mitchell felt the ground beneath her feet vibrate with that deep, resonant hum she'd noticed earlier, but now it was accompanied by something else, a sound like breathing, enormous and ancient, coming from somewhere far beneath the lake. "What is it?" Jenny asked, backing away from the water's edge as the disturbance grew stronger. Tommy looked toward the lake with an expression of recognition and fear. "It's the thing that wouldn't let me go home. It's been feeding on us, keeping us here to play with, like toys that never break." The ghostly boy in the sailor suit stepped forward, his young face grave beyond his years. "It takes children because we have the most life force, the most energy to sustain it. But it can't just kill us. It has to make us choose to stay, to give up our connection to the living world." "How?" Dr. Mitchell asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "By making us forget," Tommy said sadly. "Every time we try to remember our families, our real lives, it pulls us down into the dark water and makes us play its games instead. After a while, the memories fade, and all we remember is being here." Detective Kowalski had been listening with the intensity of a man finally getting answers to questions that had haunted him for decades. "Tommy, your parents never stopped looking for you. Your father died still believing you might come home someday." The ghostly boy's face crumpled with an emotion too mature for his apparent age. I tried to go home. I tried so hard. But every time I got close to remembering, the dark thing would call me back. It would show me other children who needed someone to play with, and I'd forget about wanting to leave. The water in the lake was now actively boiling, and something vast and dark was rising from its depths. Dr. Mitchell could see tentacles or appendages. It was impossible to tell which, breaking the surface, each one as thick as a tree trunk and covered in what looked like scales or ancient bark. "It's waking up," Lucy said urgently. "The excavation, the attention, it knows we're trying to leave. It won't let us go without a fight." The temperature around the lake dropped another 20 degrees, and frost began forming on the grass despite the summer heat. The ghostly children huddled together, their forms becoming more solid and defined as the ancient entity in the lake focused its attention on them. "There has to be a way to break the connection," Dr. Mitchell said desperately. "Tommy, you said it has to make you choose to stay. What if you choose to leave? What if all of you choose to leave at the same time?" Tommy looked at the other spirit children, then back at his own remains. "We've forgotten how to choose. We've been here so long we don't remember what home feels like." But Marcus had been studying the photographs from Tommy's camera, the ones taken moments before his disappearance. "Look at this," he said, showing the images to the group. "In every picture Tommy took that day, there are orbs of light, spirit energy. But in the last one, the self-portrait on the swing, the orbs are different. They're not just random energy. They're forming a pattern, almost like a map." Dr. Mitchell examined the photograph with new eyes. The faint shapes she'd dismissed as photographic artifacts now seemed to form a clear pattern, a circle of light surrounding the swing set, with lines of energy extending outward toward the lake. "It's not a map," she realized. "It's a containment circle, the Shawnee burial rituals. They weren't just honoring the dead. They were creating a barrier to keep that thing in the lake from spreading." The dark entity in the water let out a sound that was part roar, part scream, and part the death rattle of something impossibly old. Its massive form was now half out of the lake, revealing itself to be a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, and things that had no name in any human language. "The circle is broken," Tommy said, understanding flooding his young face. "That's why it could take us. The burial grounds were disturbed when they built the amusement park, and Dr. Mitchell knew what they had to do. We need to restore the containment circle." Dr. Mitchell shouted over the deafening roar of the ancient entity as it fully emerged from Lake Shawnee. The creature was even more horrifying in its complete form, a writhing mass of darkness and hunger that seemed to absorb light itself, leaving only shadows and despair in its wake. "How?" Marcus yelled back. His equipment scattered across the ground as electromagnetic pulses from the creature fried every electronic device within 50 yards. Tommy's ghost stepped forward, his small form somehow more solid now in the presence of the entity that had held him captive for 35 years. "The burial sites. Lucy told me the Shawnee placed their dead in a specific pattern around the lake, 7 points forming a sacred circle. The amusement park was built right over 3 of those burial sites." Detective Kowalski was already moving, his elderly legs carrying him with surprising speed toward the excavation site. "The other burial locations, do you know where they are?" The ghostly children began spreading out across the grounds, their forms flickering as the dark entity's attention focused on them. Lucy, the girl in the blue dress, pointed toward a spot near the old Ferris wheel. "There's one under the ticket booth. I remember playing there when I first couldn't find my way home." The boy in the sailor suit ran toward the water's edge, seemingly immune to the tentacles that whipped through the air above him. "Another one here, where the diving platform used to be. I can feel them. The bones are still there, still holding power." But as the ghostly children tried to mark the burial sites, the ancient entity began to fight back in earnest. Tentacles thick as telephone poles swept across the ground, passing harmlessly through the spirits, but sending the living members of the team diving for cover. "It knows what we're trying to do," Jenny gasped, crawling behind the ruins of an old carnival game. "It won't let us complete the circle." Dr. Mitchell felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on her shoulders. 35 years of scientific training told her that what they were attempting was pure fantasy, but the evidence of her own eyes and the desperate faces of the trapped children overrode every rational objection. "Tommy," she called to the ghostly boy, "you said the entity has to make you choose to stay. What if you choose to fight it instead? What if all of you refuse to play its games anymore?" Tommy looked at the other spirit children, then back at the dark mass rising from the lake. "We've tried before. It's too strong. Every time we resist, it pulls us down into the water and makes us forget again. But you're not alone this time, Dr. Mitchell said. You have us, living people who can remember for you, who can anchor you to the world you came from. The entity let out another earth-shaking roar and began moving toward shore, its massive bulk dragging itself out of the water with surprising speed. Where its tentacles touched the ground, the grass withered and died, leaving behind patches of sterile earth. Marcus had managed to retrieve his backup camera and was documenting everything, his scientific training overriding his terror. The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Whatever this thing is, it's generating enough energy to power a small city. Ancient energy, Detective Kowalski said grimly. Energy stolen from every child who ever disappeared in this lake. Tommy suddenly stood straighter, his ghostly form becoming more defined. I remember, he said with wonder. I remember my mama's lullabies and the way my daddy smelled like motor oil and Old Spice. I remember Rex, our dog, and the way the kitchen smelled when Mama was baking cookies. The other spirit children began to stir as well, their forms solidifying as memories long suppressed began to surface. Lucy clutched her blue dress and whispered, I remember my sister Sarah and the way she used to braid my hair with ribbons. The boy in the sailor suit smiled for the first time since Dr. Mitchell had seen him. I remember my boat, the real one, not the ride here. My grandfather built it for me, and we sailed it on Miller's Pond every Sunday after church. As each ghostly child reclaimed their memories, the ancient entity seemed to weaken. Its roars became more desperate, more enraged, and its movements less coordinated. The darkness around it began to thin, allowing natural sunlight to pierce through. It's working, Dr. Mitchell breathed. The memories are breaking its hold on them, but the entity had one final desperate gambit. Gathering the last of its strength, it sent out a psychic wave of such overwhelming hunger and despair that it knocked all 4 living investigators to their knees. The wave carried with it images of every child who had ever been taken by the lake, decades of young lives cut short, their energy devoured to feed the creature's immortal appetite. Tommy and the other spirit children wavered, their newly reclaimed memories threatening to dissolve under the psychic assault. But Tommy, drawing on reserves of courage that had sustained him through 35 years of supernatural imprisonment, stepped forward to face the entity directly. No, he said, his 6-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally remembered who they were. I choose to go home. We all choose to go home. And with those words, Tommy Henderson finally made the choice that would break the eternal game and set them all free. The moment Tommy Henderson made his choice to go home, everything at Lake Shawnee changed. The ancient entity's psychic scream of rage and hunger shattered every remaining piece of glass in the abandoned amusement park, but the sound was different now, weaker, more desperate, like the death cry of something that had fed for too long on borrowed time. One by one, the other ghostly children stepped forward to stand beside Tommy. Lucy in her blue dress, the boy in the sailor suit, and a dozen others from different eras, all reclaiming the identities that had been stolen from them by decades of supernatural imprisonment. I remember my name is David, said the boy in the sailor suit, his form growing brighter as his memories solidified. David Morrison. I died in 1952 when the swing chain broke, but I never chose to stay. It just kept me here. Margaret Walsh, whispered a girl in a 1940s pinafore dress. I drowned during the summer of 1947. I've been looking for my mother ever since. As each child reclaimed their identity, the containment circle began to reform itself. Dr. Mitchell watched in amazement as ghostly figures appeared at the 7 burial sites around the lake. Not the trapped children, but the Shawnee spirits who had been guardians of this place long before the amusement park was ever built. The Native American spirits raised their hands toward the sky, and golden light began to emanate from each burial site, connecting them in a perfect heptagon around the lake. The ancient entity, caught within the restored circle, thrashed and writhed as its escape routes were systematically sealed. It's working, Marcus breathed, documenting everything with his backup camera. The electromagnetic readings are stabilizing. Whatever that thing is, it's being forced back into dormancy. But the entity wasn't going quietly. With a final surge of malevolent energy, it sent out tendrils of darkness toward each of the ghostly children, trying to drag them back into its endless game. Tommy felt the familiar pull, the seductive whisper that had kept him trapped for 35 years. Stay and play. Your friends are lonely. Your family has forgotten you anyway. For a moment, Tommy wavered. The pull was so strong, so comforting in its familiarity. He'd been 6 years old for so long that the thought of growing up, of facing an adult world he'd never known, seemed terrifying. But then he heard something that cut through the entity's lies like sunlight through shadow. His mother's voice, carried on a wind that smelled of lavender perfume and fresh-baked cookies. "Tommy, honey, it's time to come home." Dr. Mitchell saw it too, a shimmering figure at the edge of the lake that could only be Martha Henderson, who had died 5 years earlier, still searching for her lost son. But Martha wasn't alone. Behind her stood Robert Henderson, and behind him, generations of parents who had lost children to Lake Shawnee's dark hunger. "Mama?" Tommy whispered, his voice filled with 35 years of longing. "I'm here, baby," Martha's spirit replied, her arms outstretched toward her son. "I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped loving you." The sight of his mother gave Tommy the strength he needed to make his final choice. Turning away from the ancient entity and its promises of eternal childhood, he walked toward his parents' waiting arms. "I choose to go home," he said firmly. "I choose to be with my family." The moment Tommy made his decision, the other ghostly children began to dissolve into points of light, not fading away, but transforming, ascending to whatever waited beyond this earthly prison. Lucy waved goodbye as her form became a dancing spark of blue radiance. David's sailor suit faded into golden sunshine. One by one, the children of Lake Shawnee finally found their way home. The ancient entity let out one final shriek of rage as its food source disappeared, then collapsed in on itself like a dying star. The dark water of the lake began to clear for the first time in decades, revealing a bottom covered not with mud and decay, but with smooth stones arranged in sacred patterns by hands that had been dust for centuries. As the last echoes of the creature's death cry faded across the water, Tommy turned back one final time to look at Dr. Mitchell and her team. "Thank you," he said, his 6-year-old face radiant with joy and peace. "Thank you for helping us remember." Then he was gone, dissolved into warm light that drifted across the lake like dandelion seeds on a summer breeze. Dr. Mitchell found herself crying without knowing exactly why. Tears of sorrow for the children who had been lost, but also tears of joy for the families who would finally be reunited. The excavation site where they had found Tommy's remains was empty now, the bones having crumbled to dust the moment his spirit was freed. But something remained in the disturbed earth. Tommy's old Kodak camera, somehow restored to perfect condition despite 35 years of burial. Dr. Mitchell picked it up with trembling hands and found that it still contained one final photograph. The image showed the Henderson family's last picnic at Lake Shawnee in 1966, but this version was different from any photo in the case files. In this picture, taken from an impossible angle high above the lake, Tommy could be seen walking away from the swing set, not toward the dark water, but toward a brilliant light where two figures waited with open arms. Detective Kowalski looked at the photograph and smiled through his own tears. "Case closed," he said quietly. Lake Shawnee was peaceful now, its water clear and still under the late afternoon sun. The rusted amusement park equipment remained, but it no longer felt ominous, just old and tired, ready to rest. In the restored silence, Dr. Mitchell could hear what had been missing all these years, the natural sounds of a living ecosystem. Birds singing in the trees, frogs croaking by the water's edge, and somewhere in the distance the laughter of children at play. But this time, it was the sound of the living, not the trapped.